16-year-old Sarah Yarborough is being remembered as talented, creative, and kind.
Sarah was an A student at the high school.
Whenever you saw Sarah, she always had a smile.
This case is about a 16-year-old girl who had the right to grow up. This case is about Sarah and everything that she should have been allowed to become.
It was Friday the 13th in December of 1991. Her parents were out of town for her brother's soccer game. She stayed home.
I was reluctant to leave Sarah. She didn't want to come, of course, because she had her whole weekend planned out. So she had a friend come over and stay with her that weekend.
We went to a basketball game, went and got junk food at the grocery store, a little bit of fast food. You know, we're 16, we were carefree. There was absolutely nothing that would make any of us think that the next morning everything would change.
So Saturday morning, Sarah woke up kind of in a panic.
She woke up and said, "I'm late for practice."
She put on her drill team uniform and ran out the door.
She went to the school and discovered that she was early. So she parked in her car and waited for the rest of her team to show up.
Shortly after the phone call started, "Where's Sarah? Do you know where she is?"
Sarah was found within an hour.
Where was her body discovered?
So her car was still in the parking lot. Her body was approximately 100 yards away, still on the school property. Part of her clothing was removed. She had nylon stockings tied in a ligature around her neck.
I just remember just saying, "Not Sarah, not Sarah, not Sarah," over and over again.
The suspect is a white male, 6 feet tall, with a medium build.
They had DNA evidence, they had everything. They had witnesses.
In that first week or so, it sounded like they had so much evidence. You know, for at least a short while, it felt like, of course they're going to catch him. And then when they didn't and they didn't, your expectations change.
You don't know if it's your next door neighbor. You don't know if it's some random stranger. There was that constant fear of, is this going to happen again?
We literally had a monster in the community, and we didn't know who it was.
How often do you think about December 14th, 1991, and what happened on that day?
Quite a bit. It's a very traumatic thing to go through.
It's been over 30 years, but the details of that day have never faded for Drew Miller.
I had my friend spent the night at my house. We woke up that morning, watched cartoons, ate cereal, left to go skateboarding.
Drew, who was just 13 at the time, lived down the street from Federal Way High School near Seattle, Washington.
The school grounds have changed quite a bit, right?
Drastically, yes. The tennis court's the only thing that's still here.
Drew often took shortcuts through the school to go skateboarding, as he and his friend did that day.
We used to hop the fence right here and cut through here. It was freezing cold that day. I mean, there was ice in all of the mud puddles. We just, started smashing them because it's fun. It sounds like breaking glass.
That's when Drew says they noticed a man in the bushes.
Right where you see the edge of this dugout right here, that was all bushes that were probably this tall. So we couldn't see him until he stood up. He's just staring at us from the bushes. That was pretty jarring, but then he just walked out of the bushes. So then we just assumed he's just smoking weed or something.
The mysterious man kept to himself and walked ahead of the boys. Drew says they didn't think much of it until they came across a horrendous scene. There in the bushes, where the man had just been, was the body of a young woman.
It was horrible, absolutely horrible. The way that he left her body, she clearly fought for her life.
Drew says his shock turned to fear when he realized the man, who was still just feet in front of them, was now staring directly back at him.
Does that look still haunt you?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's frozen in my mind.
The boogeyman, then?
Legitimate boogeyman.
The boys raced to Drew's house, and police were called to the scene.
When we approached the victim, on one of the pieces of clothing, we saw the name Sarah.
Detective Scott Strathy with the King County Sheriff's Office was one of the first officers on the scene.
And of course, later we found out that that was Sarah Yarborough. Even for experienced investigators, this scene was really hard to deal with. Just the innocent nature of this young woman in her school drill team uniform, with her hot curlers still in her hair. This was just pure, unadulterated evil.
Investigators believed this was a sexually motivated murder.
She was partially clothed. Her jacket, her undergarments, her bra had been removed and placed next to her body.
Police discovered that the car Sarah had driven that morning was parked in the school parking lot, about 300 feet from where her body was found.
There didn't really appear to be any sort of a struggle in the car itself.
Detective John Free with the King County Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit would later join the investigation.
She had a container of orange juice that she had made that morning. It was just sitting in the front seat. Nothing was tipped over. So the question was, how did she get from her car to this hill? What led her there?
Sarah was one of these people that would help anyone with anything at any time. And part of our working theory was she coaxed into following, the suspect? Did he say something like, "I'm looking for my lost dog," or "I can't find my car keys"? Perhaps Sarah, in an attempt to assist this person, may have followed him to that area.
Tell me about this one.
That was less than a week, I think, before she died. I said, "Could I take your picture? Because your great-grandma really wants a picture of you in your drill team outfit." She goes, "Okay." It was just too incredible to believe that it could even happen.
Sarah's parents, Laura and Tom Yarborough.
I mean, who thinks that your daughter's going to be murdered?
Tom and Laura had the excruciating task of having to tell their two sons the tragic news. Sarah's youngest brother, Andrew, was just 11 years old at the time.
At that age, you probably never seen or heard your parents cry much, but that pain in the voice is very, very vivid.
Sarah, who had just started her junior year in high school, had big plans for her future, starting with college.
She didn't want to go to a state school. She wanted to go to a school far away. She loved to travel.
I actually would hear her say, "I can't decide if I want to be a museum curator or an engineer like my father."
Yep.
And I was always rooting for the museum curator.
Liberty Barnes, Christy Gutierrez, Amy Perotti, and Mary Beth Tomey were some of Sarah's closest friends.
So this was after the last day of 10th grade, and we're just kind of goofing around afterwards. And that totally, you can see there's Sarah right in the middle of it, just being goofy.
The fiery red hair. Was that her personality?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
She was artistic, she was creative, she was smart, she was feisty.
Imaginative.
All of those things.
She would be the last one to wait for someone. Always be there with a smile. She would help with homework. It was her ultimate kindness.
After Sarah was ripped from their lives, they say their sense of safety was gone forever.
You grow up getting all the safety conversations with your parents, and bad things can happen, and it's all this sort of like vague possibility out there, and then all of a sudden it was like, no, 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 it can really happen. Yeah. It really did just happen.
It was all hands on deck. The sheriff's office put everything they had into solving this case as soon as they could.
And the killer left behind important evidence. Sarah had not been raped, but the killer's DNA was found on pieces of her clothing.
There was semen found on her underwear and on her jacket. We had a full male DNA profile.
DNA technology was new back in 1991, but investigators hoped that DNA would someday lead them to Sarah's killer. In the meantime, they had eyewitnesses.
I thought for sure somebody would know him.
Drew and his friend who was with him the morning they found Sarah's body worked with police, and a sketch of the man they saw in the bushes was released to the public. Police would later release a more elaborate sketch.
I very vividly remember going through yearbooks going, okay, who looks like this sketch? Everyone, it felt like at one point was a suspect.
But as days went by and as leads dried up, police kept coming back to Drew and his friend.
They just made me feel like I was the only person that could help them solve this. I know that wasn't the intent. Like, you know, the officers are just doing their best.
How much pressure were you feeling?
It's unimaginable pressure.
And despite everyone's best efforts, it would take years to find Sarah's killer.
This case was never forgotten.
In early June of 1993, 1.5 years after Sarah Yarborough's murder, local media were there as students gathered in the courtyard of Federal Way High School to honor her.
Bill Fuller, a family friend who helped spearhead the move for a memorial to remember Sarah, unveiled it with help from Sarah's younger brother, Andrew.
It was quite a day. A lot of tears as they looked at it and could see Sarah in that bench.
Bill Fuller has known the Yarboroughs for years, and his daughter was in Sarah's class.
Sarah was fun to be around. That was probably what we missed the most, is she was fun to be around.
The bench reads Carpe Diem, seize the day, a mantra Sarah lived by. Encased in bronze are some of her favorite possessions, ballet shoes, a replica of Sarah's beloved dog Gibby, and books.
Nice that people cared about her so much.
Andrew Yarborough, now an adult, admits that he struggled as a young teenager. It was especially difficult to see those sketches around town of the man police believed murdered his sister.
You know, there was drawings of the person's face all over in businesses in town. You know, I do recall that quite a bit, just having that kind of a constant reminder.
Looking back, I feel like we didn't do a very good job with the boys. I think that we were so consumed by our own grief that we didn't take time to help them.
I think we didn't really know how to help them. I mean, it wasn't something we had experience with. We didn't know anything about grieving ourselves or how to help them through it.
And they weren't alone in their grief. Shannon Grant, the last friend to see Sarah alive, says she lived with constant regret.
I wish we could go back and do it all over again. That I would have asked the other drill team members what time practice was, you know, maybe dropped her off. I mean, there's a lot of the what ifs.
The milestones were especially painful.
There was survivor guilt. Like, why am I filling out my college applications when Sarah wanted to go to college? This isn't fair.
Every joyful occasion had this sorrow that went with it. That was, there's one missing from the crowd here.
Graduation day, June 12, 1993, was an emotional day, but even more so since it fell on what would have been Sarah's 18th birthday. Laura Yarborough came to support her daughter's friends.
I do not know where she found the strength to do that.
She loved that green dress, right? Yeah, she wore green quite a bit with her hair.
Laura Yarborough says Sarah's friends helped ease her grief somewhat, and she thinks she filled the void for them as well.
Sometimes they would say, well, I'm going to date this person, and I just wanted to let you know because I wasn't sure if Sarah would approve of this person.
So they would seek approval through you. You became sort of their surrogate.
Yes.
As life slowly moved forward, investigators kept working the case.
I describe it as like a relay race where the baton was handed off from one detective to the next over the years and decades. I kind of refer to myself as the fifth Beatle in this investigation.
By the early 2000s, investigators had received over 3,000 leads, and advances in technology made them hopeful. They entered the DNA from the crime scene into the recently established CODIS system, a national DNA database that includes profiles of convicted offenders.
The strategy was to continually try to see if there would ever be a match while also investigating leads.
But over time, there appeared to be no match.
For us to have DNA evidence from the suspect but not have that linked to anybody, it just didn't make sense. It seemed hard to believe that the suspect hadn't committed any other prior crimes where his DNA wouldn't be in the system.
That's when he says detectives realized they had to go in a different direction.
My name's Colleen Fitzpatrick, and I'm one of the pioneers of forensic genetic genealogy.
In 2011, investigators reached out to Fitzpatrick to inquire about using forensic genetic genealogy, the practice of using software to compare unknown DNA profiles to information from public DNA databases and searching family trees to identify suspects. Genetic genealogy is well known now and has been used to solve numerous cold cases, but at that time, it was in its infancy.
When I started in this field, it didn't exist.
Fitzpatrick says most police agencies had been skeptical of this new investigative tool.
The police thought I was crazy, you know, this little old lady with a crazy idea, and I was actually almost laughed out the room.
But the King County Sheriff's Office took a chance on Fitzpatrick.
It was for free. I just wanted to see if it worked. What are you going to lose if you try something?
The Yarboroughs were encouraged.
I think it wasn't until we met Colleen Fitzpatrick that I really began to think, oh, you know, they're going to find this person.
And it didn't take long before Fitzpatrick came up with the name of a possible suspect that surprised just about everyone.
Everyone went, no way.
From the beginning, it was very promising. And the story took some really bizarre twists.
In 2011, 20 years after Sarah's murder, when forensic genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick started working the Yarborough case, she traced Sarah's killer's family tree back to a man named Robert Fuller, whose family had come to America on the Mayflower.
I found numerous matches to the name Fuller.
When Fitzpatrick gave the name Fuller to the King County Sheriff's Office, they immediately knew of one person with that last name. Bill Fuller, the Yarborough's close family friend, who helped get that memorial bench built for Sarah.
Naturally, that piqued our interest.
From the beginning, Sarah's family and friends believe Bill Fuller had nothing to do with Sarah's murder.
He didn't look at all like the suspect. The wrong hair color, he's short, he's not tall. He just didn't fit the profile at all.
Fuller's age didn't match the profile either. He's 79 years old now, but was 48 years old at the time of Sarah's murder, at least 2 decades older than the man Drew Miller described.
There was no way that I could be even remotely connected to the case.
He fully cooperated with police and voluntarily gave them a DNA sample. It didn't match the DNA found at Sarah's crime scene. Yet Fitzpatrick remained optimistic.
The good news is that we came up with a possible last name to investigate, and this was the first break in the case in 20 years.
Fitzpatrick knew that Sarah's killer was in the Fuller family tree somewhere, so she and her team went back to work. And as the years went by, she knew she was only getting closer, especially after 2018, when forensic genetic genealogy was used to identify the Golden State Killer.
Golden State Killer really started the big revolution. Things had evolved that we had the data to work with. The technology was in place that we could go for it.
Then in September of 2019, Fitzpatrick's team made a breakthrough. They came up with 2 new possible suspects, brothers Edward and Patrick Nicholas, who, as the DNA showed, were distant cousins of Bill Fuller.
You know, this is 8 years of on and off and looking at it, never giving up. This is it. This is exciting.
Edward Nicholas was a registered sex offender. His DNA was in the system, it was in CODIS.
But Edward's DNA wasn't a match, so they zeroed in on his brother Patrick, who in 2019 was a divorced loner who lived a couple of towns away from Federal Way.
We learned that he was working at an auto parts store, lived alone, no children, no friends or acquaintances that would even visit him. Everything that he did was mostly by bus. He wasn't driving.
Detective Ree says he discovered that when Sarah was murdered, the bus route Nicholas often took happened to go past Federal Way High School. Back then, Nicholas was just 27 years old, and around that time looked very much like the description of the sketch.
It looked promising at that point, but we still needed to get a DNA sample from him to match up to the DNA evidence that we had.
So in late September 2019, investigators came up with a plan.
We assigned a team of undercover detectives to start doing surveillance on Patrick Nicholas in the hopes of obtaining a surreptitious DNA sample.
Eventually, undercover detectives followed Nicholas to a laundromat.
They saw him go outside and smoke a cigarette, and Patrick Nicholas was seen throwing the cigarette butt on the ground. That was collected by our detectives.
That's what you needed.
Yes.
Right there, that cigarette butt.
Yes. Actually, he dropped 2 cigarette butts and a napkin that fell out of his pocket, and all 3 items were collected.
The DNA samples were rushed to the crime lab, and within days, detectives received the call they had been waiting for.
The DNA matched. This was our suspect.
Perfect match?
Yes.
Patrick Nicholas was arrested.
There were so many suspects over the years. Was Patrick Leon Nicholas ever named as a suspect?
Out of 4,000 tips, he was never named.
I was pretty in shock.
The news was a relief for Sarah's family and friends, who had never given up hope that they would get answers.
One thing the detectives kept telling us was, eventually technology is going to solve this case. I trusted that, and they turned out that they were right.
And I remember going out to my car and bawling, just bawling. Finally, they got him.
When Drew Miller, who had seen Sarah's killer back in 1991, saw Patrick Nicholas's face, he says he knew they had the right person.
What did he look like?
The same guy, just older. Just the same evil
face.
eyes. Those evil eyes stayed the same.
All these years later.
Yeah.
But it was not over yet.
Why do you think you're here? I have no clue.
During his interrogation,
Who are you in charge for?
when detectives specifically asked him about Sarah's murder, he gave an alarming response.
What we're investigating is the death of a young girl. Her name's Sarah Yarborough.
Interestingly, he asked what year this was, and that really sent up a flag.
Why?
Why would you ask that? He's being told this is a murder case. We're wondering at this point, are there other victims?
This is it. I'm not going to say anything.
After 1.5 hours, Nicholas asked for an attorney and stopped talking. But his criminal record would speak volumes.
I am the one that got away.
On a quiet morning in June 1983, 8 years before Sarah's murder, 21-year-old Ann Croney was sitting by her car along the Columbia River in Richland, Washington, when a man approached her.
He seemed normal, kind of friendly, actually, just friendly. I had asked him if he'd done any water skiing yet, because he said he had just moved to town, and he said he couldn't swim. And he said, "My name is Pat Nicholas."
After a few minutes of small talk, she became uncomfortable.
I noticed his voice was getting shaky, and I told him I had to go. I went to close the door, and he put a knife to my throat. Everything kind of stopped at that moment. He told me to take my clothes off.
Nicholas stuffed Ann's underwear into her mouth to prevent her from screaming, forced her out of the car, and led her to the riverbank.
We got about halfway down the bank, and he told me to stop. I ran and dove in the river because I was thinking he couldn't swim. Swam as hard as I could.
Swam for your life.
I swam for my life.
Passers-by found Ann at a dock nearby and called police. As it turns out, 19-year-old Patrick Nicholas was no stranger to law enforcement and had a record. He had raped 2 women and attempted to rape a third.
He'd been convicted of rape as a juvenile and had actually only just been out for a few months when he attacked me.
Days after Ann's attack, he was tracked down, arrested, and pled guilty to attempted rape. He told authorities, "I realize that I have a problem concerning raping girls." At his sentencing hearing, Ann spoke out.
I was actually very angry and asked the judge for the maximum sentence. And the judge did agree and sentenced him to 10 years. So I thought it was over. I thought that justice had been served.
But Patrick Nicholas did not serve the full 10 years in prison. He was released after just 3.5 years. Ann was never notified. She barely thought of him again until October 2019.
The police knocked on my door and said that there were detectives in Seattle that wanted to talk to me about a cold case.
They informed Ann that Patrick Nicholas had been arrested again, this time for the murder of Sarah Yarborough.
They told me that there were similarities in the cases, and I was crushed. It had never occurred to me that what I escaped from was a murder.
What's more, if Nicholas had served his full prison sentence, he would have still been behind bars that December morning in 1991, unable to murder Sarah Yarborough.
How angry are you to hear that he was released that early? And
Very. It brought up a lot of the old anger and even more anger because the system failed.
King County Deputy Prosecuting Attorneys Celia Lee and Mary Barbosa describe him as a serial predator with a clear pattern.
All of the women were approached at or near their car. He would strike up conversation and then pull a knife and tell them that they needed to walk, where he would order them to take off their clothes and then rape them.
Nicholas had also been convicted of sexually assaulting a minor in 1994, 3 years after Sarah's murder. 5 sexual assaults that investigators knew of, none of which had required him to submit his DNA, so there was no record of him in the CODIS database. But in pretrial hearings, the judge ruled that Nicholas's criminal history could not be entered in as evidence.
She found that it would be unfairly prejudicial to the defendant.
But the prosecutors were hopeful their case was strong enough.
All rise for the jury.
In early 2023, more than 30 years after Sarah Yarborough's murder, her accused killer, now 59 years old, went on trial. Sarah's childhood friends were there.
I so clearly remember the morning before the trial started just going, I don't know if I can do this. Like, you know, I had so many different emotions flowing through, and it was like, no, we need to be there.
There was this absolute love for Sarah and the Yarboroughs that was so strong.
Did you feel like they were a lifeline for you?
Yeah.
Be seated.
You weren't in it alone. You were all in it together.
As the trial got underway, the focus was on the DNA.
What was your strategy then in trying this case?
Well, we needed them to trust the science.
There was a field that was emerging called forensic genetic genealogy.
Patrick Nicholas's public defender, David Montez, challenged how forensic genetic genealogy was used to first identify Nicholas.
I want to dig into the science because
The first time that kind of defense had been used in Washington state.
they use technology that is not only unproven, but just wacky, really. He's not the person that killed Sarah. The police needed an answer more than they needed the right answer. And so they turned to new, novel, untested technology.
Genetic genealogy is a new field. It really hasn't been tested out. Should we be making important decisions based on something that is not well or deeply understood?
But the prosecutors said that argument was moot because Patrick Nicholas's DNA matched the DNA found at the Yarborough crime scene. And Detective Free says the numbers were astronomical.
The odds were 1 in 120 quadrillion that...
Quadrillion, yeah.
Right, that it was somebody else.
If the numbers pointed to Nicholas's guilt, law enforcement says so did evidence found at his house near the time of his arrest in 2019.
It was almost like a lair. There was no working electricity at this house, stacks of pornography all throughout the place. We also found a newspaper from 1994 that had on its front page an article about the Sarah Yarborough case. And going through one of the kitchen drawers, we found a torn photograph taken from a magazine, a woman in a cheerleading outfit.
When the prosecutors showed that photo in the courtroom, the oxygen left the room.
Yeah.
Montez downplayed their significance.
I think both of those pieces of evidence were not especially strange given the general state of his house. There were stacks and stacks of newspapers all over his house.
This is evidence tape.
Patrick Nicholas didn't flinch as the evidence was shown, showing no emotion throughout the trial. But Sarah Yarborough's presence was felt, especially when now retired Captain Scott Strathy carefully unpackaged and displayed Sarah's clothing that had been in storage for over 30 years. Her drill team jacket, shoes, sweater, even her nylon stockings.
This was like opening a time capsule.
All of a sudden, they were real things. They weren't even photographs. They were the things she had on her body when she died. You sort of felt yourself crumble.
After 9 long days of testimony, the case went to the jury.
All eyes for the jury.
It took them just over a day to reach a verdict.
I was shaking, and like just that, like there was so much adrenaline and so much anticipation.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Patrick Leon Nicholas.
Everything just dropped, and it's like, what?
Why do you think it took law enforcement so long to identify Patrick Nicholas as a suspect? Take a look at a timeline of the case at 48hours.com.
The
This is the state of Washington versus Patrick Leon Nicholas.
Sarah Yarborough's loved ones had waited over 30 years for this moment.
We, the jury, find the defendant,
But then,
Patrick Leon
shock.
Nicholas, not guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree, premeditated.
Patrick Nicholas was found not guilty of the first charge, premeditated first-degree murder.
I remember dropping my head to my hands. I was angry, I was in disbelief.
When that first one came in not guilty, I closed my eyes.
But there were other charges, and there was still hope of a conviction.
Guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree, guilty in the second degree.
Patrick Nicholas was found guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree murder. The jury ruled both had been committed with a sexual motivation.
I remember hearing the family behind me cry, and I made eye contact with the jurors and nodded at them. You know, they got it right.
I feel so grateful for those detectives, for the boys, for the previous victims, for every witness who took the stand. So grateful that all these people came together.
2 weeks after Nicholas's conviction, dozens of people who had been involved in every part of Sarah's case gathered back at the courthouse for his sentencing hearing. Prosecutors asked the judge to impose extra time to take into account all of Nicholas's crimes.
The sentencing hearing was exhilarating in a way that I never expected. It was probably the most raw human courage I have ever seen in my life.
Sarah's death left our family broken, and we've never been the same.
The pain in my father's voice over the phone telling me Sarah was dead.
Person after person took to the podium to say all that Patrick Nicholas had taken from them.
Coming face to face with pure evil that day has deeply impacted my entire life.
He took her life and what was sure to be a brilliant future from her. In taking Sarah, he took the innocence of every one of us.
To face Patrick Nicholas and to say what they had been wanting to say to his face for 30 years.
Patrick Nicholas is pure evil.
There was so much power in the room. It was electric.
And then Ann Croney, who wasn't allowed to testify at Sarah's trial, started speaking.
He just did like a double take and shuddered when Ann stood up.
Like he saw a ghost.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sure he didn't expect to ever see my face or hear my name ever again.
We rely on a system of justice that is designed to protect us from predators like Nicholas. And this system failed me, it failed Sarah, her family, friends, and countless others. I ask the court to please not make the same mistake.
After everyone spoke, Judge Josephine Wiggs addressed the court.
When I think about this poor child, and what she experienced fighting for her life.
Judge Wiggs put her fist on the thing and said, "This was a child." She kept saying that, and all I could think was,
oh my gosh.
That's right. We were children.
Yep.
Nicholas received a sentence of almost 46 years. For Sarah's family and friends, the sentence brought mixed emotions.
I don't know that this is justice. It is a verdict, and it is putting someone away for something that they did. But he got 30 years that she didn't get.
It makes me mad that he was free for so many years, and who knows, however many other people were hurt during that time. I don't know that we'll ever know, and that could have been avoided.
Forensic genetic genealogy helped solve Sarah's case, but prosecutors say similar technology could have identified Patrick Nicholas years earlier if only familial DNA searches were allowed in Washington state. In a familial DNA search, an unknown DNA sample is compared against profiles already in CODIS to search for possible family members. Remember, Patrick Nicholas's brother's DNA had been in CODIS for years.
The legislation just doesn't exist in this state to allow that search.
California uses it. The UK, as I understand,
New York, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Colorado, Florida.
Do you think it's time to get that law changed?
We do.
Me too.
The Yarboroughs agree and hope that Sarah's case can make a difference.
I would like to know that other parents don't have to wait 30 years.
What do you hope her legacy is?
I think her legacy is she was always someone who brought people together. She's brought all the people together that attended the trial. That's the kind of person she was.
For Drew Miller, who at 13 found Sarah's body, the connections made at trial finally brought him some peace.
Knowing he's in prison is fantastic, but knowing her family and friends is way more important to me, because that's what's given me the actual healing that I needed.
This is probably the beginning of our junior year.
Sarah's friends will always remain bonded by the past and Sarah's stolen future.
Not only was she beautiful, her soul was beautiful, and the grace and the beauty that she carried and left with all of us, we won't forget her. We will never forget her.
New CBS Next.
He's not breathing.
A surgeon's girlfriend found dead.
He provided those drugs.
Was this a case of a controlling doctor's depravity?
This was not just some simple accident. This was much more.
A new 48 Hours, next on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
Welcome back to another episode of Postmortem. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Green, and today we're answering your biggest questions from our latest episode, The Hunt for Sarah Yarborough's Killer. Joining me are 48 Hours correspondent Natalie Morales and producers Chris Young, Ritzen, and Lauren Clark, who reported and produced this episode. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Hi, Anne-Marie.
Hi, thank you for having us.
So, one of the reasons why this story kind of really hits you is because you almost feel like you knew Sarah in high school. She's the kid that you wanted to be friends with. She has everything going for her. She's an incredible young woman. Everyone agrees. Big plans for the future. And then it is ripped away from her. So before we dive into Postmortem, I just want to play a little bit of an overview from this week's episode.
We used to hop the fence right here and cut through here.
On December 14th, 1991, 13-year-old Drew Miller and his friend were walking through Federal Way High School outside Seattle, Washington, when they noticed a man in the bushes.
He's just staring at us from the bushes. That was pretty jarring.
The mysterious man walked away, but he left behind a horrific scene. There in the bushes where the man had just been, the boys discovered the body of a young woman, 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough.
It was absolutely horrible.
Drew says his shock turned to fear when he realized the man, who was now just feet in front of him, was staring directly back at him.
Does that look still haunt you?
Oh, yeah. It's frozen in my mind.
The boogeyman, then?
Legitimate boogeyman.
The boys raced home and police were called. Detective Scott Strathy with the King County Sheriff's Office was one of the first on the scene.
Even for experienced investigators, this scene was really hard to deal with. Just the innocent nature of this young woman in her school drill team uniform with her hot curlers still in her hair. This was just pure, unadulterated evil.
Sarah had not been raped, but the killer's DNA was found on pieces of her clothing.
It sounded like they had so much evidence.
Sarah's friend Amy Perotti had hoped that the killer would quickly be found.
For at least a short while, it felt like,
Of course they're
going to catch him. And then when they didn't, your expectations change.
Sarah's friend Shannon Grant.
You don't know if it's your next door neighbor. You don't know if it's some random stranger. There was that constant fear. Is this going to happen again?
You know, Natalie, Drew is an adult, right, as he's speaking to you. And so you sort of have to remember that he was a 13-year-old boy at the time. And as he goes through the episode and describes, you know, what he saw and how it changed his life, one thing that I never really considered is that he felt incredible pressure. He felt because he had seen this guy, he should be able to help them solve the case.
Yeah, I mean, he was under such tremendous pressure, and he still feels that all these years later, you know, nearly 30 years later. You do have to remember he was 13 years old, but yet he locked eyes with this guy. He and his friend, they got a clear look at him. And as he said, that look would forever haunt him. Detectives worked with him over many years to get what they thought was a really accurate sketch. But yet at the time, when you think what that picture looked like, as Sarah's friend said, when they looked through their high school yearbook, it could have been anyone from those yearbook pages because, you know, that's what everybody looked like back then. They had the mullets. That was the style. That was, you know, the hairstyle back then.
What was it like for Drew to testify at trial, to lock eyes with this man again?
It was a lot. Drew had really been anonymous for many years because he was a minor at the time. His name wasn't publicly released. He kind of knew who the Yarboroughs were, but he wasn't, you know, friends with them. And he felt kind of isolated. So at the process of going into trial and knowing he'd have to testify and that he'd have to be there on the stand looking at Patrick Nicholas, it was a lot. But the community that developed at trial, like so many of Sarah's friends and family and neighbors, just people wanting to support the Yarborough family, but they also ended up helping Drew too. For so many years, he had this horrible image of Sarah in his mind. He saw her in death, but then through getting to know her family and her friends, they filled in who she was in life. And that has meant so much to him. Even at the sentencing hearing, some of Sarah's friends gave him like a packet of photographs of Sarah. And he talks about that all the time, that the image of her in his mind has now changed. And that's really part of the healing that he needed for himself in his life.
When we did our interview with Drew, we did it at Federal Way High School. And there in the courtyard of the high school is a memorial bench that's dedicated to Sarah. And it was emotional because Drew brought a flower and he put the flower on the bench and he sat there and he had his head in his hands. And it was a very emotional moment because you could just see him reflecting and you could really see how this all affected him. So it didn't make the show, but it was a very emotional moment.
It's so interesting how these tragic moments create almost kind of a new family. This one family is completely ripped apart by the loss of their daughter. And all these other people now, even though the connective tissue is tragic, are now part of her legacy and part of that family. So Natalie, what was your biggest takeaway from this case?
For me, it was, you know, there was so much initially. There were eyewitnesses. There was DNA evidence. So why did it take investigators nearly 30 years to find Sarah's killer? Police did receive leads and tips, but Patrick Nicholas, the man who ends up being the murderer, was never named.
That's so interesting. Let's listen to a clip.
By the early 2000s, investigators had received over 3,000 leads, and advances in technology made them hopeful. They entered the DNA from the crime scene into the recently established CODIS system, a national DNA database that includes profiles of convicted offenders.
The strategy was to continually try to see if there would ever be a match while also investigating leads.
But over time, there appeared to be no match.
For us to have DNA evidence from the suspect but not have that linked to anybody, it just didn't make sense. It seemed hard to believe that the suspect hadn't committed any other prior crimes where his DNA wouldn't be in the system.
Patrick Nicholas had a criminal record and he had attempted to rape a woman, as you saw in our story, the survivor Ann Croney, who tells her incredible and harrowing story. That happened back in 1983. And while it was on his record and he served time for it, his DNA was not entered into the CODIS database back then. He also had another charge, first-degree molestation of a minor back in 1994, but he was able to plead that down. So he ended up not having to submit his DNA. So that's why he got away for nearly 30 years.
And, at the time of Anne's crime and her attack in 1983, there was no CODIS database. That wasn't established until 1999. So, it seems like an outrage now, but back then it just wasn't part of the standard.
It was really frustrating learning that he had attacked another woman, another young woman, Anne Croney. I want to play a little bit of her sound.
I noticed his voice was getting shaky, and I told him I had to go. I went to close the door, and he put a knife to my throat. Everything kind of stopped at that moment. He told me to take my clothes off.
Nicholas stuffed Anne's underwear into her mouth to prevent her from screaming, forced her out of the car, and led her to the riverbank.
We got about halfway down the bank, and he told me to stop. I ran and dove in the river because I was thinking he couldn't swim. Swam as hard as I could.
Swam for your life.
I swam for my life.
It's incredible that Anne has a presence of mind to know, hey, jump into the water. I just had a conversation with this guy. He says that he can't swim. I'm throwing myself in there. It's really remarkable.
It's truly incredible. In fact, Anne is just one of the most courageous people I have met. And I've met a lot of survivors over the years of reporting on these kinds of stories. There was also a moment that she revealed to us in our interview that she wanted to take back that part of her life. And in order to do that, she decided to do a triathlon over the summer, diving right back into those very waters that saved her life. She swam this time to accomplish an incredible goal, completing a triathlon. I think you hear a lot of survivors saying, I wanted to get myself back, my power back. And in that moment, she did just that.
I was so moved by the fact that this moment in her life didn't define her at all.
Yeah.
She could talk about it. It's not like she was putting it in a black box and not acknowledging it, but she didn't let it be anything more than a speed bump in her life,
Yeah.
Natalie, that's a great story. After Nicholas was convicted for attempted rape of Anne Croney, the judge sentenced him to 10 years, the maximum sentence. But then Nicholas is released early on parole just 3.5 years later. Did anyone even call Anne Croney to let her know that he was out, or was that not the protocol?
Nope. Anne-Marie, unfortunately, the answer is no. She was not notified at all. And she just told us that, she assumed that Patrick Nicholas had served most of his sentence. And that obviously wasn't the case. He was only in prison for 3.5 years. And I think this speaks to the way that victims were treated back then, 40 years ago.
Anne told us she was quite upset when she found that out, thinking, I got justice for what happened to me. And thinking that he had served that whole time and then finding out that had not happened really crushed her.
And it's particularly devastating because if he had served the full sentence, he would have still been in prison in 1991 when he attacked Sarah Yarborough. And then we wouldn't even be talking about her murder. Why was he released so early?
I mean, we got the records from, back then, and they really, he went through the parole board process. They considered him, he didn't have any major infractions on his record. He admitted to everything that he'd done. He admitted to Anne's attack. He said he had a problem. He realized it and he wanted to get help. So part of the terms of his parole was that he would enter into a treatment program, that he would be getting this help that he needed. But as we see, it wasn't enough. But he did actually meet the standards at the time.
When we get back, we're going to get into Sarah Yarborough's trial. Forensic genetic genealogy was at the heart of this case. But with Nicholas's attorney really calling into question the technology, would the jury believe the science? We're going to get into that after the break. Welcome back. Lauren, you were in the courtroom during the trial. What were her friends and family's reaction to finally seeing this case go before a jury?
I mean, it was big for them. They'd waited a long time for this. And, you know, Natalie and Chris and I know we cover a lot of trials. Court can be like a very cold and intimidating environment. But I got to say, I have never seen a community come together the way they did at this trial. It was not just Sarah's friends and family. It was neighbors. It was members of the Yarborough's church. It was Sarah's former classmates, adults. They're in their late 40s now. They came together from around the country. People flew back to be there for the Yarboroughs and support them through this. Everybody kind of, among Sarah's friends, they all had their little roles. One friend, Liberty, who we interviewed, she had a snack station set up outside that courtroom every day. She and her husband, they had bottles of water. They found out what candy Laura Yarborough liked. It made such a stark experience feel warm.
You know, you would think that so many people have gone on with their lives to return to this area for this special.
They did, but also, you know, they were teenagers when this happened. A lot of them kind of carried this internally with them for so long. And so, I mean, it was like a therapy session almost.
These people are incredible. And Anne Croney showed up as well. What was it like when she came to the courthouse, though?
Well, it's interesting because nobody knew who she was. Anne tells us about how the first time she went, you know, there weren't any seats on the side of the Yarborough. So she sat on the other side and she could tell she was getting some looks. That people were kind of looking her up and down, trying to figure out who is this person. And then, you know, out and break in the hallway, some of Sarah's friends actually approached her and said, like, how are you connected with the case? And she introduced herself and she said, you know, I'm the one who got away. He attacked me back in 1983. And they all described it as just hugs immediately. And like, we're here with you. We're so happy you came. Thank you for being here. Like, it's so important to us that you are here. And during the sentencing hearing, she shared a very powerful victim impact statement because she was not able to testify at trial because none of Nicholas's previous criminal history could be entered in as evidence.
Why couldn't it be talked about?
Yeah, you know, it's at the discretion of the judge in every case of whether prior bad acts are going to be allowed in as testimony at trial. In this case, the prosecution put forward motions that they wanted to have Nicholas's criminal history entered into trial. And the judge ruled against allowing it because this case was going to be decided on this crime singularly.
Forensic genetic genealogy played a vital role in finding Sarah's killer, but the defense really put it into question. Let's take a listen.
Patrick Nicholas's public defender, David Montez, challenged how forensic genetic genealogy was used to first identify Nicholas.
I want to dig into the science because
the first time that kind of defense had been used in Washington state.
They use technology that is not only unproven, but just wacky, really. He's not the person that killed Sarah. The police needed an answer more than they needed the right answer. And so they turned to new, novel, untested technology.
Genetic genealogy is a new field. It really hasn't been tested out. Should we be making important decisions based on something that is not well or deeply understood?
Hey, listen, if any of you are on any of these genealogy databases, I'm all into this stuff. I'm on like 2 of them, but you get notifications all the time that you got an 8th cousin or a 10th cousin. You know, it's
Yep.
We're related to everyone. So you can kind of see where he's coming from in terms of this argument. But is it a strong argument? How reliable is the science behind genetic genealogy?
Well, you know, it is a relatively new way of cracking cold cases, perhaps the most notable being the Golden State Killer case. The forensic genetic genealogist in our story, Colleen Fitzpatrick, she is considered one of the pioneers at the forefront. I think a lot of our 48-hour viewers may recognize her because she has been on a couple of past episodes, as she is so well known in this field. And she spent years searching, building out a genetic family tree of the possible killer. And she narrowed it down to these 2 brothers, Edward and Patrick Nicholas. Interestingly enough, Edward's DNA profile was in CODIS for a sex offense that he had committed, but he was not a match. Patrick wasn't in CODIS at the time. So investigators still needed a true DNA sample. And so detectives surreptitiously collected DNA while Patrick Nicholas was at a laundromat. He dropped some cigarette butts. They picked them up and it was a perfect DNA match. And if anybody wants to argue with the science, here is the number for an exact match. 1 in 120 quadrillion. I can't even tell you how many zeros that is, but that tells you how exact of a match this is.
Should viewers be concerned about law enforcement having access to their DNA?
I think this is something that law enforcement wants to be very clear on now, because there have been a lot of kind of guide rails put up, particularly since the Golden State Killer was arrested. Now it's really only you have to opt in for your DNA to be searchable on one of these databases. But like in general, they're not searching Ancestry and 23andMe. They have to be these certain opt-in databases.
Oh, that's interesting. Ultimately, the fact that Nicholas's DNA matched the sample found on the body rendered the defense's argument moot. He was found guilty of first and second degree murder, but he wasn't found guilty of premeditated murder. Why is that?
In this case, we didn't interview any jurors, but Lauren did speak to a couple of them after trial. Basically, they told her that there wasn't enough evidence to prove, how much, if at all, that Patrick Nicholas planned the murder.
But then they also said, after the trial, they were told about Nicholas's previous criminal history. And when they heard about kind of his pattern of behavior, they said, maybe that could have changed things for us. If we had known that, maybe we would have gone the other way on this. But it's so hard to tell.
I want to talk about the judge, Judge Wiggs. She spoke really passionately at sentencing about how Sarah was just a child when she was murdered. She sentenced Nicholas, though, to 46 years, not life. Did the length of the sentence surprise any of you?
This actually is on the higher end of sentencing. Judge Wiggs, who is an incredible judge. I mean, you saw the power. She kind of slams her hands down and says, "This was a child." And she hit the table with her fist. You felt that, her outrage when she was looking at Patrick Nicholas. She went above the sentencing guidelines because of Nicholas's other crimes, including the attack against Ann Crony. She was able to share during the sentencing.
Yeah. And, Patrick Nicholas was 59 years old by this time. So it's effectively a life sentence for him.
It was bittersweet because, Patrick Nicholas, he lived a free man for 30
Sarah
years.
didn't have that time.
Sarah didn't have that time. So it's a life sentence, but it was bittersweet for the family and the friends.
What was it like talking to the people who knew Sarah best?
She's still such a huge part of their lives. They talk about her as if it was just yesterday. These memories are still so fresh in their mind. It was such a formative time in their lives for all of them. They all were victims in a way. These young women had to live life thinking that, could that be the guy next door? Could it be him? I walked away feeling like I could have been friends with these women. I mean, we're all somewhat of the similar age group. Looking through their pictures and the photo albums, it was like looking at a slideshow of my own youth growing up and just feeling like I was a part of that in a way.
This murder took place on the campus of a high school. So, I mean, it's not just the people who were friends with Sarah, but all of these kids had to, I presume, at times walk past this location. I mean, how did the school handle it at the time?
So this crime took place on a Saturday morning. And what we learned is that school was back in session just 2 days later on that Monday. Can you imagine? So these kids all had to go to school, walk by the police, the media, the yellow tape, the crime scene every single day. And for so many of them, they were traumatized. Sarah's friends told us that they really leaned on each other. And one of Sarah's friends told Natalie that her teacher basically made an announcement and said, "We will not be learning much for a very long time, except basically how to deal with trauma."
One of the things that I thought this hour kind of reinforces is the ripple effect of a crime. But instead of being defined by that moment, they created a community out of it. They supported each other. They pulled together closer. What will you guys take away from covering this case?
I think that is the greatest takeaway right there, Anne Marie. It's the people she loved, the friendships she formed. Those are the people who are her legacy and continuing her story and her journey.
And they are together for life in this. I mean, it's really created these bonds and helped them heal in a way that I don't think everybody gets.
Sarah left a legacy of love.
Simple. So true.
Yeah, simple.
That is it for this week's Postmortem. Natalie, Chris, Lauren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you again,
yes,
Anne-Marie.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie.
Be sure to watch 48 Hours Saturdays at 10, 9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus. And be sure to follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music or Wondery app.